Thanks, Audra. It's good to see many of you. I'm happy it's Friday. I hope you are too. It's been kind of a gloomy week, but it's good to be here this morning. I work at the State Board of Education, as Audra said. I'm on our student support team, and I preside over our student and family rights team, and that includes special education dispute resolution. So I speak with a lot of parents and a lot of schools when they're running into challenges with special ed or 504 related issues. And I also work with our family engagement person and then our youth in custody folks. So we've got a broad range of kind of programs, but very focused on rights for students and families. And I've been at the board for a little over 5 years. So I'm excited to be here today. I'm gonna share my screen here, get things going. And Audra approached me. She gave me tons of notice months ago when the conference was being planned. And this was honestly, even though I've been working in special ed law for about 10 years, my background is I'm an attorney. I had not thought that much about this aspect. I did a lot of policy work in my early career with helping students with disabilities who are of high school age kind of transition into life after high school. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later. But when I did that work, I was in DC. So I was in a very metropolitan area, and many people don't have cars there. And so it was very much a focus on helping kids learn how to use public transportation and the subway and the bus schedules and things like that. So this was a great opportunity for me to kind of learn a little bit more. And I share that with you so you know I'm definitely not an expert on driver education, but what I hope to do is to share just some of the aspects of special ed that I see as applying to the work that you do. As we go along, please pop in questions and chat, and Audra is awesome at kind of monitoring and taking care of stuff, and so we'll kind of tag team that. But just know that, you know, she's the expert on driver education. So there's a question that comes up that I don't know, she's going to help me out. So what I wanted to start with, this is a quote from the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA. The IDEA was passed in 1975. And I think it's important to remember that prior to 1975, there were millions of kids with disabilities who were not allowed to attend public school. And so when Congress passed this law in the 70s, that is when we began as public schools ensuring that all students had access. And this comes from the preamble of that law, or kind of that beginning section. And I really like this quote, and I think it has some good applications to our topic today. So it says, disability is a natural part of the human experience and in no way diminishes the right of individuals to participate in or contribute to society. Improving educational results for children with disabilities is an essential element of our national policy of ensuring equality of opportunity, full participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency for individuals with disabilities. So I hope you can kind of pull out some strands that connect with the work that you do. I always, when I do trainings, I kind of try to help teachers understand, you know, you may be teaching 2nd grade, you may be teaching 4th grade, but whatever range we are from preschool all the way to post-high, our goal for our kids is that they can have as independent of a life as possible, that they can be economically self-sufficient, that they can have equality of opportunity. And I think it's important to remember when you look at the national statistics of adults with disabilities, we still have a lot of challenges. Many adults with disabilities are living below the poverty level. They have very limited access to their community. They have a limited social circle. And there are a lot of issues with unemployment or just jobs that pay a living wage. And so we've seen things evolve over time, and there's more and more opportunity. But as I thought about this topic, I did think, you know, how much that driver's license, at least for me when I was 16, kind of meant independence. It meant better access to a job as a teenager, and it meant being able to go hang out with my friends and do things in building a social circle. So I want us to kind of have that mindset as we jump in today, and we're going to talk about some different laws and things now to see kind of how that applies. For kids with disabilities, we have several federal laws that come into play. Section 504 was passed in the 70s as well, and the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in the 90s. And both of these laws are anti-discrimination. They're civil rights laws. So basically what these laws say is government agencies, state or federal government entities that receive public funding, they cannot discriminate against individuals on the basis of their disability. And I've already mentioned the IDEA. That was more of an Educational Opportunity Act. So that act did come with funding. It is very limited to the public kind of elementary and secondary realm. Students who qualify for protections under the IDEA will often have an IEP or an individualized education program. But there are some students who don't need that full level of support or special ed services, but they may need some accommodations, and that's where we have kiddos with that Section 504 plan that you have probably encountered in your professional work. So I want folks to remember the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504, they are kind of broader. They apply to all these kind of avenues of public living. They apply to parents who may have disabilities, who may need to access some school public meetings or, you know, different things in the school realm. And then we get all the way down to that IDEA student focus. So Section 504, as I mentioned, I think I've kind of touched on that. I'm going to keep it moving. But this is a key element to kind of take away. Students with disabilities under Section 504, the law kind of looks at, do you have an impairment that would impact a major life activity? And it lists a huge list of major life activities, and that includes learning, breathing, walking, just all sorts of ways that a disability could impact you as an individual. And it requires entities to make reasonable accommodations. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what the definition of accommodation is in a few slides. But I think many of you are familiar with that. And so it's this idea that we do accommodate students. That said, a related idea in the law is this fundamental alteration. And it says that a public entity can decline to make an accommodation if it's not reasonable, and if it was a fundamental alteration, which is a change that is so significant that it alters the essential nature of the goods, services, facilities, privileges, advantages, or accommodations offered. This is really key in the driver education kind of landscape because of, as I've gotten into it just a little bit, and as you could probably tell me if I sat down to chat with you about this, there are specific qualifications that the driver's license division requires. And there are certain things that you have to do that cannot be altered, because to do so would be a fundamental alteration in terms of expectations that are very much tied to safety for the student, for you, and for everyone else on the road. And so I think it's key is that you work together with your administration, with the students, either 504 team, which is sometimes less defined than the IEP team, but especially, and we talked about this in the first session, Audra was great to point it out. If a parent's asking for accommodations and you're not quite sure, make sure that you consult with someone in your administration. Public school districts and charters are required to have an ADA coordinator or a 504 kind of coordinator, someone who would help manage those requests. And particularly if you're going to deny an accommodation, you just want to make sure you're doing that in alignment with the law, that you have good documentation. And so being careful in terms of written and spoken communications. And I always tell folks it's okay if you don't know the answer quite yet. If a parent makes a request or a student and you're not sure, it's okay to say, I'm not sure, I need to check back with you. And as long as you do so in a reasonable time, that's okay. So don't feel pressured to agree to things on the spot. If you're not sure, it's totally fine to kind of go back and consult with team members who may be more familiar. And Audra always points out, you can give her a call. You can call other folks in our building too, like me or someone on our team if it's more kind of disability focused. So the IDEA, as I said, is broader. It came in terms of protections for kids in the preschool to post-high environment. Because students with that, they're going to qualify for more than accommodations. They're going to qualify for services, aids, and supports. I wanted to just pull out some key highlights. And this comes from the Department of Ed, and they point out that a big part of the IDEA was having high expectations for students. And so one of the things that I wanted to make sure that we think about is that we never kind of make a decision by ourselves or based on assumptions or bias about what students are capable of. I think it's important to talk with the student. It's important to talk with the family. And it's important to talk with other school staff and experts who know the student. And it's still going to be individualized participation for every student, but I think we should always be operating from that background of let's have high expectations and focus on what they could do and not just what they can't do. We do want to be focused on helping them lead productive and independent lives. Meaningful opportunities to participate, and then just a reminder that they qualify for different services, and those could be provided in the special ed realm. They could be provided in other core classes to help support. I mean, I think reading and writing seems to be a big element of this process. Paying attention is a big element. And I think a lot of folks may not, if you don't have a ton of experience with kids with disabilities, you may be more aware of the kids who have physical disabilities or those visible things that you can see. But what I always tell people is that about 60% of our kids with IEPs in Utah, they have what we call hidden disabilities. They have learning disabilities. And so you may see them out in the hall, you may see them interact with peers and may not be able to tell that they have any challenges that are atypical. But many kids have ADHD, they have dyslexia, they have math disabilities. Some kids have fine motor issues. So it could, any student with an IEP could have some things that impact their ability to access this program in some way. And so it's key for the IEP team, which could include you, to kind of look at those issues. Assistive technology is a piece. I'm going to touch on that a little bit later. So the law kind of outlines who needs to be on a student's IEP team. It is, an IEP should not be developed by one person at the school and then run by mom and student or dad and student. Instead, we need to have at least one regular ed teacher, a special ed teacher. We always have an LEA rep who is typically an administrator who's been designated to kind of preside over the process, to commit any resources, to make sure everyone's participating. In many meetings, we have folks who are there to help interpret evaluations. And as I dug into this process a little bit, it does look like sometimes there are evaluations that may need to occur of certain students. And so that may be a time where you pull someone in who knows how to interpret that evaluation and can kind of help us as a team say, okay, what do we need to do to help the student access? What services do they need? And then there's also this bullet point that kind of says the school, which I say LEA, just that means local education agency, district charter. The school or the parent can also invite other folks to join the team. And so I can see where there may be times where it would be helpful for the driver education teacher to be a part of that. And it's really case by case. The thing about it is, especially in secondary, kids usually have a bunch of gen ed teachers, and usually they can't all come. And so the laws kind of tried to strike a balance of saying we just need at least one person at the team meeting. That said, what I want you to be aware of is the law says that when a student has an IEP, every staff member who is responsible for implementing that should be aware of the IEP, should be able to access it, and should be aware of what their responsibilities are. And that's really key when it comes to particularly accommodations. As a driver education teacher, you may not be the one providing the reading services or the specialized math services, but it's helpful for you to know what the accommodations are in terms of accessing classwork or other areas. And those things need to be decided by a team and then communicated. So if you aren't sure which students in your class have a 504 plan or have an IEP, reach out to your administrator, reach out to your SPED department, make sure. I know we've kind of come a long way with kind of our student information systems, and when I'm out monitoring, most folks say, oh yeah, I get a list, or I get a list of accommodations, I can kind of tell what's going on. But we want to make sure you have that information, and also that you're able to contribute information in the process. School counselors can sometimes be a part of this too, and I think that as you see the last bullet I didn't talk about, when a student is 14 and older, the law requires that they be invited to participate and be involved, because we are talking about transitioning them to life after high school. And so we want to hear from the student. We want them to be able to start developing those self-advocacy skills. And part of the transition plan is a course of study where we determine when different courses need to be taken that align with the student's goals. And so I know for students with disabilities, we may be delaying driver education a little bit, but I think it's a good team discussion that different people can have. So when a student qualifies for an IEP, they have this plan or this program, and it has a bunch of different elements that I wanted you to be aware of. As I mentioned, a lot of times the accommodations are shared, but folks aren't always able to see the whole plan unless they ask. It kind of depends school by school. And I want you to be able to see the whole plan if you feel like it would be helpful and to help you be aware of services and supports. There are goals in the plan, there are services. There's an element that talks about a student's participation in statewide testing. And some students need communication supports, behavior supports, or assistive technology. These students who have challenges in other classes, they're going to exhibit those same challenges in your class. So we've got a lot of kiddos with kind of attention and behavioral issues who cognitively are probably fine to take the driver education course, to take the test, and may do fine, but may need some help learning appropriate behaviors, particularly when they're going to go and take a test with someone from the DMV in their car and things like that. In terms of test participation, we're going to touch on this in a minute about students needing accommodations and the appropriate way to do that with a driver license division. That said, I think it's helpful to be aware of what accommodations many students may access on statewide testing, because those may be accommodations you apply to different assignments in your class, or that parent and student can advocate for with the driver license division. A lot of the common ones we see are kind of extended time, sometimes having a reader, either speech or text to speech where the program itself reads to you, or sometimes kids with perhaps writing issues or some issues demonstrating what they know, being able to do speech to text. When I called the driver license division, they were very much, they said they handle it on a very much case-to-case basis. So they don't have a list of accommodations, but if you do a basic Google search, you can find articles from parents and advocates and specialists in this area across the US who kind of speak to ideas of accommodations. But I think it's helpful to, we always try to say whatever a student gets in one realm in terms of accommodations, it's helpful to know because we'll often apply those to other realms. So again, for kids 14 and older, they do have this transition plan, and they're supposed to identify goals. They're supposed to identify what they would want to do, and sometimes that means linkages to outside agencies. One of those agencies is often vocational rehabilitation, and VR can step in and provide support in terms of services or payment for certain things if a student has needs related to their disability that relate to employment. That's their main job, is to help folks prepare or access employment. And so there may be times where consulting with vocational rehabilitation in this realm might be helpful if it's related to a student's employment goal. So as I mentioned, you've probably heard both of these terms. I think it's important for parents and students to kind of understand the distinction, because if a student has an IEP in different parts of their school day, the team can make both of these elements part of their plan. And a modification is something that is not allowable under ADA or 504. And so as students leave us and go on to college or employment and things like that, they can qualify for reasonable accommodations. They may not be able to obtain modifications. And so a key distinction is an accommodation is something that's a change to instructional or testing procedures or materials that allows a student to fully access the information and to accurately demonstrate their knowledge. But they're required to learn the same content at the same level of proficiency. And as I noted, it doesn't change the content, it doesn't change the expectations, it does not reduce the requirements of the task. And when you bump that up against what a modification is, that is different. A modification does change learning expectations, it does reduce requirements, and it does change instruction or curriculum. And I think it's key to remember, and you guys know this better than I do probably, a lot of the system you're working with driver education is connected to state rules, other state agencies' requirements. So you're not really in a position where you could modify it even if you wanted to. But we do run into a challenge sometimes in the special ed world or kids with disabilities, where I have some parents who want to over accommodate. I think the mindset sometimes is whatever's available as an accommodation, I want that for my student. And kind of at this age of 14 and older, we are trying to help parents understand, of course, let's provide those reasonable accommodations that a student may need, but let's also try to fade supports as much as we can where appropriate, because we want the student to become more independent. And we face some opposition from parents sometimes at this age, because I think sometimes they're coming to grips with this idea that this student that they've worked really hard to protect and support and try to make sure they access things like all other kids, it's hard to let go, just like it is for any parent, I think, as their kids become moving towards young adulthood. And so there are times where a parent will be kind of defensive and protective. And so I think it's key for us to be able to kind of communicate these two things. And I think understanding these two concepts too can help us as a team determine whether or not a student may be able to fully participate in this process, because there are students who maybe their disability is significant enough that even with accommodations, that may not work. But again, I'm speaking in general terms, and I think what Audra would encourage you to do is if a student wants to participate in elements, approach that and work toward that, and then just work with the different structures we're talking about, the laws and requirements, and work as a team to kind of make decisions moving forward. I was digging around the internet, and I think as I did this, I was reminded that this is just a really key piece in your work that involves family engagement. I told you I have our family engagement person on our team, and of course IEP development involves the parents. But as I thought about kind of different topics that kids take in secondary school, this one just involves parents so much more than other areas. And I kind of just didn't think about it, because Also, things were a little bit different when I came up. I don't think I had to drive with my parents as much as kids do now to get that learner permit. And so I found this on a website kind of geared towards parents of kids with kids on the spectrum. So we do have a lot of students with autism in the state. And you've maybe heard the saying, if you know one kid with autism, you know one kid with autism. They're not all the same. But we have many kids who are higher functioning, who cognitively can grasp information and material, but may not always pick up on social skills and may not kind of pick up on nuances of communication. And so these were some questions that they posed that I still feel like are applicable to many areas of kids with disabilities, because particularly our kids with ADHD, which is a bigger population too, attention issues. We've got kids who have behavioral challenges, and I thought these questions kind of do a good job of signaling some skills that our students need in terms of good judgment around peers, receptive to constructive criticism and instruction. That is a hard skill for all of us to learn at times, and can be really hard for some students with disabilities who don't always interpret criticism or instruction in the same way that other kids might. Is the student going to need specialized instruction or a driver assessment? Is your child agreeable to practicing with a skilled driver? Are there medical or behavioral conditions? Are there medical interventions that they need to ensure safe driving behaviors? And what I want to point out is, for some of these skills, they can be taught and they can be built with some of our students. With some, the deficits may be too big and they may be a barrier to them obtaining a lesson, but I think, or a license, but I think that's also where we bring in these other experts too. And so I didn't include the wealth of things that I found, but it does seem that across the nation, there are folks who specialize in this. There are private programs who specialize in this. And so there are resources out there that parents can go to get some of the pieces they may need to get through this process. And I never tell a parent, if a parent calls and says, hey, you know, I want my kid to get reading, what they're getting at school is great, but I want additional help for them. Is that bad if I do that? No, a parent can always access private services. But what I want to make sure that we do as a school, in a school setting, is we always provide access and accommodations to everything that we offer. And we never encourage a parent to go elsewhere to get supports and services that we're required to offer, because to do so would give the appearance of discrimination. So we do what's reasonable within our realm. And if parents want to go kind of take part in some of these other things, they can. And in some ways they will, because they may be the one kind of coordinating the medical assessment with the driver license division. But it's helpful for you to know these pieces so you can kind of direct them, or just say, you know, this is what the driver license division is going to require. So make sure you look into that. So as I looked at kind of the driver license division webpage, first time driver license requirements for kids under 19, these were the different elements that I saw outlined, and you know this because this is your bread and butter. But for me, again, as I think about just different students with disabilities who may come into your classes, as I mentioned, you know, different kids may need different supports. And so I think particularly with the IEP team or with parent, with administrators, if you're working with the Section 504, I think it's really important to kind of think through each element. How does a student's disability impact their ability to participate in the course? How does it impact their ability to complete a written test and then this driving skills test? And so I think it's key. There can be times where we can kind of focus on one thing and not pay attention to other things. And this process does kind of have different skill-based elements as well as written elements, knowledge that different kids may struggle with. And so just kind of being mindful of how their accommodations and supports can apply to different areas. Some past questions we got this week are, you know, If a student does need support in the course, but you need some support doing that, again, reach out to the special ed team or kind of be aware of who is providing those IEP services. There are some students who can grasp this with additional time and help. And just like kids get support in their reading or their English classes, there are interventions that teachers do, such as pre-teaching, reteaching, reviewing concepts, chunking things down, kind of changing the way that material is taught that can help certain students really grasp the information. And so, of course, I hope that you can, embed some of that, because those are principles of universal design for learning and kind of differentiated instruction for kids. And I know you have students who may just be struggling learners a little bit who don't have identified disabilities, but work together as a team to kind of understand students' needs and don't feel like it's all on you. If you need to reach out to other folks in the building, please do that. So this is kind of what I alluded to a little bit earlier. I know that there is this knowledge test, and you'll see in bold language, and this comes from our driver education manual, any student needing accommodations on this knowledge test needs to take the test at the driver's license division. And so schools are not in a position to provide a reader, an interpreter, or any other accommodation. And so I think it's key to just remember that and to direct parents there. That said, I think it's helpful to coach parents and students a little bit, like, here is what you have. Take your IEP with you. And that can be documentation of accommodations you've received in the public school setting, and they may take that into consideration as they give an accommodation. I did speak with my colleagues who work in this realm more on my team, the transition realm, and just kind of said, what's your experience been? Because they were special ed teachers prior to coming to the board, and both of them kind of shared experiences where it wasn't always a slick process, and sometimes the student may have failed or kind of struggled before the driver license division granted the accommodation. But I think it's different for every kid, and it's different probably at the different regional offices. When I messaged the DLD, that's what they said. You need to direct it to your individual office, and we'll consider those requests as they come. That said, I also kind of wanted to pull out a piece of the standards. As you probably know, we are a big standards-based agency. We have standards for all of these different core areas that students participate in. And when you look at the IDEA and how IEPs are being developed across the country, the Department of Ed has made a big push. We need to have standards-aligned IEPs. And that's huge for kids with disabilities, because with the history of low expectations, when the IDEA first started out, the key was kind of just bringing students physically into buildings and letting them go to lunch, letting them play at recess. I say letting them. They should have always been included, right? But even in early times, it was much more a focus on physical inclusion. And I think over time, we have evolved to say they should be accessing and making progress in core curriculum too. And of course, some adaptations can be made for students who need that support. But I say that because, again, I think the standards are another piece to look at and kind of go through each one as a team and say, what are some areas where a student may need support because of their disability, and how can we provide that extra instruction or that extra support, or and that may include implementing some IEP goals, or seeing how they connect to what they already have. So I want to remind us that standards kind of help give us that guidance and that guardrail, and then we can pick pieces from those to maybe provide extra support if needed. So I feel like I've talked about this a lot. Just it's a team thing. We need to bring in occupational therapists or physical therapists if that's a need. We need to talk to each other. I always say I love working in the field of education, and particularly special education, because my colleagues are great problem solvers. I feel like I work with so many great people like you who are flexible, who kind of have that growth mindset and say, okay, here's a challenge, let's problem solve, let's figure it out. And I think we're used to sometimes coming up with creative solutions because of limited resources at times. So I think those same skills apply here. Wanted to just touch on assistive technology. If a student needs assistive technology to access the program elements that you offer, then you need to provide that as the school. And I've heard Audra pipe in different presentations and say, if you're having challenges or don't know how to do that, reach out to her. Also, if you're working with any contractors or any private programs, if you're working with them and paying them to do a service for you as part of this, you need to make sure that they're providing those accommodations as well, because the law sees them as basically an extension of you. But I do think it's important to kind of understand boundaries between public and private here, because again, I'm going to get to it in a minute. I'll hold that thought. What role does the driver education teacher play? You play a key role in kind of understanding and determining if a student can operate a vehicle safely enough to participate in behind the wheel training and successfully complete driver education. And that's a big job. I mean, I think that's a big responsibility for any students, right? But if you have safety concerns, then you review the student's abilities and here are some of the skills you're looking at. And so again, I just want to make sure that you have support in making that decision through the information from the team, through information in the IEP, and that we all check our biases and assumptions, because especially if we're newer and have less experience, we may have some different beliefs about what kids are and are not capable of. And what I always say is, you know, use data-driven decisions. So make sure that if you're making these determinations about safety that would limit a student, that you just have good information to base that on. And I know that you do. So have those decisions be data-driven. And so as I kind of poked around the driver's license webpage, I'm sure you're all familiar with this functional ability in driving. And again, I think this comes up in kind of communicating that accommodation versus modification thing. These are things that the state legislature has said that a driver has to be capable of and has to do. And so if we suspect some issues, then that is where we come into this functional ability evaluation report. And so just making sure that parents understand the role that this plays in the process and helping students too, and then helping them access forms and kind of pointing them in the direction of different professionals who may be able to offer these assessments. I pulled out one of them because, again, as I told you, our biggest kind of group of students with disabilities in Utah is students with learning, memory, and communication challenges. And as I looked at this kind of spectrum, I can see a variety depending on how significant their disabilities impact them. And so again, I think there are elements of a student's disability that will not change, but there are some elements that we can accommodate and we can support, and they can develop greater skills. And so I think when I work with special ed teachers and educators in general, I think you're great at kind of pulling out those skills and developing lessons and developing ways to teach students what they need to know. So I think using standards, using these things can be helpful in kind of assessing need and seeing if there are things that can be taught versus things that may need to be accommodated or may not be, and help us in our decision making process. So I did speak with a special ed teacher that Audra referred me to as somebody who's done this work a lot, and it was really cool to kind of hear her experiences. She shared some tips with me that I wanted to share with you guys. I'm just like losing my speech at 9 in the morning. She pointed out that I think sometimes families may kind of stall taking the driver education class, wanting to wait till the student is older. And so she says she thinks it's good to encourage them to take advantage of it when it's a free public offering, when student is still enrolled in school. So again, to me, that's kind of just examining as a team when the right timing is. She talked about how some parents have wanted to borrow the school's adapted car and that that's not allowed. So again, I think it's that boundary piece that you need to make adaptations to cars or provide that for the piece that you're responsible for that a student's participating in. But for the private pieces and the pieces that happen with their parents, they need to come up with that. But again, if you can point them toward resources of where and how they could do that, that's helpful. She pointed out, and I know this is a generalization, so I'll say it is a generalization. It's not true for every student, but she feels that working with many students who use wheelchairs, sometimes they're not used to watching out for others. They're used to people getting out of their way. And she's noticed that can be a learning curve kind of in the driving environment, that they generalize that experience to driving, and she's had to kind of teach them, no, you know, we need to have explicit instruction and practice that when you're on the road, you need to be paying attention and yielding and waiting for your turn and things like that. She did talk about one accommodation that she's seen be really helpful for certain students, particularly students who are learning to drive adapted vehicles, like students who need hand controls or students who are slower processors. And she's seen kids who are slower processors get there. They just needed more time and practice. So she talked about kind of working in conjunction with the range to make sure that students sometimes had that extra time for instruction and practice. I wanted to remind you that in Utah, we're lucky we have a team called Utah Assistive Technology Teams. They're based at vocational rehabilitation within workforce services. And they can do free consultations to look at hardware, software applications, assistive technology, equipment, anything that can help folks with disabilities in a lot of ways. And they are very experienced. They've worked with people in the range from, you know, preschool, little children to older folks. And they are always kind of, they have great information about like cutting edge technology and all sorts of things. So if you come across kind of a unique situation, you're wondering, they do those free consultations. So work to reach out and see if they can support you in the work that they do. Audra said that this resource is linked on the USB website. And so I just found this as I was poking around. Like I said, the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia had a ton of stuff around driving. And this one, of course, is parent supervised driving lesson plans. But I loved how they had kind of an assessment you could download as a parent that goes much deeper than what the state's assessment does. And really, like I said, a lot of kids with disabilities kind of need things chunked or broken down and explicitly taught. And that is not something that always comes naturally to any of us. It's a skill that teachers develop because it's your wheelhouse, but parents may not. And so as parents are working a lot with students kind of developing these skills through practice and through even after they get their license, I thought this was an awesome resource with videos, with instruction to kind of help parents know what they don't know in terms of preparing their teens to be successful, competent drivers. I did want to point out, and I kind of talked about this before, I mean, if driving is not an option for some of our kids, I think it's important still to have planning in the IEP and elsewhere about how we're going to help them stay mobile. And I have really liked the aspect of how ride sharing has gotten bigger, because I do think it provides greater access to folks with disabilities to getting around. We still have some room to do for people with physical disabilities and accessible vehicles. But generally, if you're a student with a disability who is not going to be able to drive, I think it's important to make sure that we work with school and family to teach them how to take public transit if that's available in your area. to utilize taxis or ride sharing, and then also to carpool with classmates or coworkers. And I know as a college student living away from home who did not have a car, that was a skill that I had to develop a lot in those years, was kind of problem solving and communication and being brave and asking some peers if they could give me a ride and sharing gas money. So we want our kids to be able to get around in whatever way is appropriate for them. So this is my name and my contact information. Again, I think Audra is the big expert, but I love that this project helped us get to know each other a little bit better. And if you do have questions, you can always direct them to me and we'll be in consultation. But I'm gonna, someone says, are there any accommodations that the state has for special ed students when taking the permanent test at the DLD? What I try to convey at the beginning is, as a state agency, they do need to provide reasonable accommodations. But when I reached out, they did not give me a particular list. They said it's very much based on the individual. But what I have heard that some individuals have received is probably some reading accommodations. And again, it's kind of that point that like they still need to know what you know and comprehend. But if you have a reading difficulty and it would help to hear it read rather than read it yourself, things like that. But you'll need to direct those to the DLD office in your area and they would work with you to access reasonable accommodations. If a student ever feels like they're not receiving reasonable accommodations, the Department of Ed, I'm going to stop sharing, sorry, I want to see. The Department of Ed houses an Office for Civil Rights, and folks can direct complaints to them, which they would investigate. And on one of our previous sessions, Audra pointed out there is case law out there about some of these things that you can look at, but that would be a dispute resolution method that if a parent felt that, or it's still about the individual, but the parent's often helping the student. A student could file a complaint with the Office for Civil Rights if they felt like they were not being granted reasonable accommodations or they were being discriminated against on the basis of a disability. So that's my content. I think I get through it a little faster every time because I have more practice. We didn't have as many questions this time, or Audra took care of them while I was chatting. But if anybody has any other questions, I'll stay on for a minute or two. And I think I'll let Audra wrap things up.
Thank you, Naté. It doesn't look like there's any other questions. Some people are asking about credit. It doesn't matter if you use your phone or your computer, but I can see the webinar knows it puts in your name or your email or it puts in information. So I know that you're here. However, if you're watching it as a large group and you didn't all log on, then I would need to know that you guys are on as a group. Some other questions that came in. I teach driver's ed online and have a student with a 504. So yeah, when you're doing online courses, you also have to make sure that you accommodate for what their 504 is and their IEP is. Naté, if you want to say something more about online courses.
No, I mean, that what Audra said, but that is a newer challenge over the past year. And so I think it's important to use that IEP or 504 plan. And if it doesn't seem to speak to what you're going to need, then work together to kind of troubleshoot. I think we've all been in that learning pattern for the last year of how do we make that possible. That said, you pointed out the mother has asked for a reduced workload. And so again, if a student, that could be a reasonable accommodation, it could be a modification. So it's important to understand the distinction depending on what we're talking about. And so if there is an accommodation like that, it should be in the plan. And we want to do things consistent with the plan because the law says have a plan and work from it. That said, we can change the plan. If a need arises we can work together as a team, but there are processes that must be followed. We can't just do it by ourselves. It needs to be data driven and based on the student's needs. So there are times in high school where different needs come up and the team says, oh, we hadn't considered that before. So we want to make sure we amend the plan or we work with the plan. It's a problem in any class if a teacher starts giving things to the students or providing things that are not embedded in the plan, because it creates kind of confusion about whether it's necessary because of their disability or not, and could present challenges as the student goes into other classes and can get the school in trouble by saying you should have been providing this and these other things. So I think it's key to work with the team. And in terms of deciding if that would be an accommodation versus a modification, I think it's again important to recognize, is this changing the expectations, or is it keeping the expectations for what the student needs to know and do the same, but accommodating them because of their disability? And we see that a lot with like tests or homework assignments or different things. Sometimes you can eliminate questions and eliminate aspects of a test or an assignment, and it did not alter what the students expected to know. Rather, it kind of reduced the workload in such a way that made it accessible to the student because of their disability. But it's important for you to be able to understand as content experts, and I don't know the nature of your tests and assignments, but there are times where things can be shortened to kind of get at, does the student know what they need to know, but eliminating kind of a busy work or a practice piece. It's just going to be very dependent on you knowing your material and knowing what the student needs to know, because in this realm especially, it's not looking like we can modify a ton, but we can accommodate. And I think that's key for us to know how to explain it to parents, because sometimes this is a new concept for them. And so kind of helping them understand the expectations for what they need to know and do are the same, but if we need to limit some things because of their disability and still maintain those same expectations, then that would be appropriate.
Yeah, Naté, you said that perfectly. We need to make sure that parents understand this is to obtain a driver's license. So it's not necessarily just another subject they're taking at school or just providing it at school. So they still need to make sure that they get their number of statute hours and the standards that are required within it. And so some of those things can be changed a little bit, but a lot of them, it's just the law requires for you to get a driver's license. That's what you have to be able to do. So there's a fine line with it.
I think it's that fundamental alteration piece that I talked about with 504 and ADA, and I see a big connection in the driver's license realm, because this is, like you said, I mean, there are just certain things that cannot be altered, because to do so would fundamentally alter what the state's expectations and requirements are, and we're not in a position to do that. And I don't want you to feel like you'll have to be attorneys and use a lot of technical language, but I think it's always good to be able to kind of describe this and practice describing it to parents, because where a lot of the calls I get with dispute resolution, it's just communication and understanding breakdown. And so learning to kind of communicate and problem solve together and kind of understanding where boundaries and limits are.
I would completely say the same thing. When I get a phone call from a parent, it's because a lack of communication or a lack of information being passed back and forth. Like a lot of times it's being passed to a student and then it's being passed to a parent, and then there's a gap in the information. And so it's really important to make sure that you document or make sure that you write down or even send an email back to a parent and saying, am I understanding this? This is what I'm hearing you saying, and make sure that they understand what the goal of that child is. Sometimes they just want their student to be like the other students and experience driver's education, and they might not even actually want them to have a driver's license, or the student might not want to have a driver's license. They just want to have the experience. But in saying that, you never do anything in driver's education that would affect the safety of the student, yourself, or the public. So they have the right to try, but you never put someone in danger. You might spend the whole time in a parking lot and never get past the first lesson, but they still have that right to try and to get that whole entire 6 hours of training.
Well, thanks. I hope everybody has a good weekend. I'm going to sign off and enjoy the rest of your day and the conference.
Thank you, Naté. Appreciate it. If anybody needs to get a hold of either one of us, just let me know.